So welcome to this event. My name is David Hay. I'm the chair of HL7 New Zealand, and on behalf of HL7 New Zealand, I'd like to welcome you here, and I'd like to thank you very much for coming along. There's a couple of sort of housekeeping things that you sort of need to say first. Mobile phones. If you've got any mobile phones, it would be greatly appreciated if they were on silent mode or switched off. If a mobile phone goes off in one of the talks, our policy here is to shoot the person, so it's fairly serious that would actually happen. The toilets are kind of back straight through there. Another big advantage of this arrangement is you can get to the toilets really easily. In the unlikely event of an emergency, Linda will guide people out the door and into the street. So does anybody not know who HL7 New Zealand is? Okay, so this slide is totally redundant. So we basically, we produce standards for healthcare interoperability. One of the, I guess, benefits of coming to this event is that you are now automatically enrolled as an HL7 member, which gives you all sorts of really, really useful benefits that we'll talk about after you've given us a possible evaluation. We'd very much like, slightly more seriously, we'd very much like to thank our sponsors for this, Orion Health, who have sponsored the lunch, and SysMet, who have sponsored the morning tea. So without kind of the sponsorship of these organisations, it's very hard to run these sorts of events. And that's Orion's logo there, so we've done the lunch. And obviously this day is divided into two parts. So this morning you're going to have the somewhat dubious pleasure of listening to me talking about FHIR. This afternoon there'll be a number of presentations on SNOMED. This is a bit of a promo for an expo that we've got coming up next year. Alistair, I think, will talk to us a bit more during his presentation. We're having a pretty big SNOMED-based event at the end of next year, so I want to make you aware of that. So I'm going to run this morning, and Alistair will be the MC for the afternoon. So I'll just switch slides at this point. Hopefully everything will still continue to work. Hopefully I can find something else. Okay, so my presentation, my bit of the day is to talk about HL7 FHIR. I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have as we kind of go through this presentation. I've got a fair bit I'd like to cover, so if it's something which is going to take a bit of discussion, then we'll probably take it offline. Do feel free, if you've got any questions with anything I say, speak up and we'll do our best to answer them. This is the program, the agenda for the morning. It's slightly different to what was on your program there, but we'll certainly try to cover off all the various items. I'm going to touch on why FHIR came to be. And just a show of hands, who in the room is reasonably familiar with FHIR already? Who has never heard of it? That's a good start. So that most people have kind of heard of it but don't know a lot about it, which is great. Hopefully by the end of this morning session you'll know a lot more. And I'm going to talk about where we use FHIR in New Zealand. I'm going to call out a few sort of use cases I think where FHIR might be useful. Then we'll dig into FHIR a little bit. We'll have like a primer on FHIR. I'll talk about what it is, what it's about, the key parts of it and so forth. I really want to introduce you to a tool that we've been developing as part of HL7 International to help clinicians become more involved with FHIR. One of the key themes I think for today is how clinicians and VAs and such like can become involved in this new standard. It's not just techies anymore, it's the users who can become a part of this. I'm going to touch on terminology, although that will be just a bit about how FHIR works with terminology. We've got a whole session this afternoon on the depths of SNOMED. You'll learn a lot about it then. I'm going to spend a bit of time on profiling. So profiling is a very important part of FHIR. It's actually how we take FHIR and make it work for us. So I'll spend a bit of time on that. Then I'm going to come back to where can we use FHIR in New Zealand. And hopefully over the course of the morning we will have answered some of the questions as to how we can do it. And then finally I'm going to wrap it up by sort of saying where do we go to from here. What I'd like to achieve out of this morning, what would be great would be if you were to understand where FHIR can fit into our health IT landscape. It would be wonderful if you wanted to learn more, if you wanted to attend more seminars, connectathons and such like. It would be great if we start to think about what some pilots and what the infrastructure that we need to be. So they're the sort of success criteria that I've got for this session at the end of it. Who am I? This is me. I think a lot of people already know who I am. One of the problems of being an advocate for something in this world is you tend to be noticed. I'm an ex-clinician. I currently work for Orion Health as a product strategist there, although I'm here in my capacity as the chair of HL7 New Zealand, so I'm certainly not promoting any company line here. I've been involved in FHIR pretty much from the beginning of its development. I'm one of the co-chairs of the FHIR management group, and we help with driving the actual standard. One of the other things I do is I write a blog on FHIR, and one of the things you find out when you start to write blogs is you try to get people coming to your blogs. So there's the URL there, another valuable prize for all the people who actually come to my blog. And a lot of this, the little link on the other picture there has a meaning. FHIR, there's a saying, you know, I think it was Isaac Newton, you know, I see so far because I stand on the shoulders of giants. A lot of what FHIR is all about is building on what other people had done before. And I think it's important to recognise that. I'll touch on this a little bit later on. But FHIR is a culmination of a lot of smart people's thoughts. I'm the guy on the top there, by the way, looking out over the top, not the giants down there. So why FHIR? Why did sort of FHIR come about? So I'm just going to touch on some of the drivers, I think, which caused us to think about developing FHIR. So our interoperability requirements internationally and in New Zealand as well are increasing dramatically. This is all about the increased collaboration that we need. Oh, if you guys, we've had a slight malfunction here. If you guys can't see well, there's probably some better seats over the side there. Yeah, so we've got increasing interoperability requirements. Things like involving the patient, which is raising the bar quite significantly in terms of the ability to share data. Need for real-time access, you know, particularly mobiles. Mobiles are huge these days. A vast increase in the type, the amount, and the source of information that we're getting is putting pressure on our current ways of getting data across. Analytics and the need to gather data and to do population type reporting on them. And then finally, implemented expectations. Another key theme that I'm going to try and bring out over the course of this morning is that FHIR is all about the implementer. And to be honest, some of the earlier standards that we've got are not implementer friendly. So one of the drivers behind FHIR was to come up with something that was good for an implementer. And just touching on some of the other standards that are out there to say, well, why just don't we use those ones? So these are some of the other standards that we have available to us. HL7 version 2, well, it's a messaging standard. It's very, very widely used. We use it in New Zealand and it will continue to be used. And it's great for messaging between systems. But it's really old technology, you know, what we call pipes and hats. Who here is familiar with HL7 version 2? Right, excellent, well that's great. So it's older technology and it's really hard to extend. And that's actually a slight lie. It's actually really easy to extend, hard to extend in a way that makes sense to anybody else. So, you know, it's a great standard, it's not necessarily the one we want moving forward. HL7 version 3, well that was an attempt to try and, you know, create a common model and to have us all talking about that common model. In practice what actually happened is it was stompingly hard to use and there have been a few large implementations, but by and large HL7 version 3 really hasn't met the requirements. CDA, again another very successful standard, it's actually part of the V3 family, but it's about documents. About moving documents around, not around some of the other things we want to do, particularly real-time access. And getting, whilst you can get sort of, narrative level information out of CDAs, getting coded, structured data is not that easy. You know, internationally we've found that people struggle to get sort of structured, coded data out of a CDA. And then OpenAIR. OpenAIR is of course not an HL7 standard, it's the OpenAIR Foundation. And it's a standard that is excellent for modelling. That's really where its strength is. Before I will correct me, wherever he is, I'm wrong on that one. But it's not particularly a messaging standard. However, it can still participate, as I will take shortly. Here's a business case. Quite often, you sort of, you know, you come up with a new standard and we say, well, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. You really need to be getting on with this new standard, Mr. CFO. And they say, well, why? So this is a sort of a business case for FHIR. This is the sort of things that you might say to somebody who's questioning the value. You might say that an awful lot of design work has already gone into it, a lot of resources have already been created. And the API, the way that we share data, has already been defined. It covers all paradigms and all architectures, as we'll see as we go through this presentation. Implementer friendly, again there's that theme coming through. Make it simple for implementers to actually use this standard. Mobile friendly. You know, we can't ignore mobile these days. Things mobile first. We should be doing mobile. FHIR excels at mobile applications. And you don't need to understand the healthcare domain to implement it. This is another really important point. If you're in some of these older standards, it actually takes a developer a fair amount of time to get up to speed with them. With FHIR, that's not the case. FHIR uses industry standard technologies and such like, and we've had situations where developers have come in at our connector phones that we hold, and within a day have actually developed applications that can talk to FHIR servers. So what that does is that tremendously increases the pool of implementers that you have when you want to develop and implement a FHIR-based solution. It's already in use internationally. We know of at least 70-odd countries that are doing something. There's one country, Lithuania, that's actually gone completely FHIR and on DST1. Pretty much every continent except Antarctica. But the obvious thing here is if you're going to Antarctica, do let me know, because it would be nice to fill in that bit. And there's an enormous community for support. Excuse me. You know, we have support channels via Skype, via email, via list servers, via Stack Overflow. It's not uncommon to get an answer to a question literally within minutes. And if I was feeling brave, I put a test question up there and see how long it took people to respond. You just have to take my word for it, because I'm a bit risk averse over the moment. So what those things do is they mean that you can create faster implementations that are much more reusable and are therefore a lot cheaper to deploy. And that's really one of the key things about FHIR from the perspective of a CXO. It's about this point in the presentation when I realised that I've sort of been talking about FHIR all the time without actually defining just what it actually is and what does that acronym stand for. So FHIR, F-H-I-R, stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. And so the fast means that we try to develop things quickly, as quickly as we possibly can. Interoperability means that its primary domain is the interoperability space, although, as we'll talk about, it's actually moving slightly more into the modelling space as well. And resources. Resources are a key part of FHIR. And I'm going to be talking a bit about resources in just a second. And so it's the latest interoperability standard from HL7. This is a kind of manifesto that we put up. It's not an official manifesto, but it sort of calls out the key parts that we really want to achieve with FHIR. This focus on implementers is going to come through over and over again. We want to make life easy for implementers. Targeting support for common scenarios. If things we want to do commonly, make sure that they are done easily. Leveraging web technologies. Again, this is all part of using stuff which works. People are used to using things like HTTP, web technologies, XML, JSON, and so forth. So we should be using those as well. We shouldn't be doing our own thing. We should be reusing what actually works. This concept of human readability is a base level of interoperability. This is the lesson of CDA. As I said, CDA is certainly one of the most successful stories out there. And part of that reason is that using CDA, you can communicate human information to a narrative to a clinician really easily. And then you can go on and start having structured and coded data on top of that. So we've learned from that, and every resource in FHIR can actually have a narrative element if it needs it. Multiple paradigms and architectures, I've already talked to that. Making content freely available. So previously, in order to use an HL7 standard, you actually had to sign up and join HL7. FHIR is not like that. FHIR is freely available. You can go onto the web. I'll show you where the URL is later in the day. You can download it and you can use it. You don't have to have anything to do with HL7. So there are advantages to being part of HL7, but it's not an absolute requirement for the use of FHIR. And actually, it was FHIR which kind of tipped HL7 itself over the edge. And you may or may not be aware that now all HL7 standards are freely available. And FHIR was the driver that pushed that along. And interestingly enough, HL7 hasn't folded because of it. It's caused it to actually reevaluate the way that it does business, and actually what it caused it to do is say, how do we serve our customers better? You know, and that's not a bad thing. This is the timeline for FHIR. This is how long we've been around. It was first thought of back in 2011 or so as part of an initiative called the Fresh Look. And this was actually where HL7 International had realised that their existing standards weren't necessarily meeting the needs, and so they had a project which said, if we're doing it from scratch today, how would we do it? And a very smart guy called Graham Grieve, who's an Australian, he was born in New Zealand, which is one of the reasons why he is so smart, and so he led up a small task force that sort of looked out there and he looked what other people were doing. And he looked around at the way that the Twitters and the Googles and the Facebooks and how those guys were actually sharing their stuff. And that's where the concept of resources and interoperability came from. This is part of that looking at other people, seeing what works, and building on it to make it better. So we're currently at the what we call the DSTU phase. DSTU stands for Draft Standard for Trial Use. In plain English, what that means is that it's good enough to be useful now. It's complete enough, we think, that you can do stuff with it, real stuff with it. And we absolutely encourage people to do that. We want feedback, we want people to use it, tell us what works, what doesn't work, and we'll work to make the standard better. And there's pros and cons to that. The pro is that it means you can seriously influence the standard. If you try to use FHIR and you come across something that simply doesn't work for you, then let us know. On the actual specification, there's a link on every single page which encourages you to go and give feedback to the spec. We have a tracking system which monitors all of that. The con is that it's going to change. No two ways about it, it's going to change. We think we're now at the stage, once DSTU2 passes, hopefully in about a month, where that change is going to be much less than it has before, and certainly DSTU2 is the version that you guys should be looking at, but it has to be acknowledged that we are allowing changes to occur from this point forward. But nevertheless, good enough to get started. And this is kind of interesting. This puts FHIR in the context of some of the other standards in terms of the timeline. So HL7 version 2 came out in 1987. As I say, it's still around, still working. We use it in New Zealand extensively. If you look there, you'll see that CDA version 3 took almost 10 years from inception to a standard which was actually able to be used. 10 years, you know, that's a long time. In FHIR, we've been around for around about 3, maybe 3.5 years now. This slide's a tad old. But this is kind of showing that we're really trying to move rapidly, and we're really trying to be reactive to what people actually want to do. And you can use FHIR in a number of different ways. These are just a few that I've called out. So that picture to the left there is you might be using, might be a broker, you might be an integration engine which converts between, say, FHIR and other standards, V2 and V3. And there are a number of options out there, including stuff from Orion and others. You might have an existing system and you might want to put a FHIR interface in front of it. And this is something that a PMS vendor might want to do, a GP PMS vendor. They've already got a data storage layer. They might want to put a FHIR interface in front of that, or Enigma, as we were talking about. You might want to put a FHIR interface in some of your services. And then finally, you might actually go all the way, and you might develop a system that depends completely on FHIR resources. And quite a surprising number of people are actually doing this right now. And this is part of that story I was saying, how we started out with interoperability, but we kind of segued gradually into the model sort of space. So those are just a couple of the ways you could use FHIR. This is kind of answering this, all paradigms, all architectures kind of story. This is a rather interesting one, I think, for us in New Zealand. So this is the concept of standing up a vendor-neutral repository, a FHIR repository, that can take FHIR resources from pretty much any other system. So at the top there you have a hospital information system, a laboratory information system, PACS, GP PMS system, or hospital PMS system. And they're all integrating with that vendor-neutral repository using a FHIR type interface. Now the nature of that integration will depend completely on the actual system itself, of course. It might be simply posting up summaries, it might be something like sharing a My List of Medicines kind of thing. Nevertheless, what it means is that it means that multiple systems can start to reuse data, we can start to share data across systems. And then down the bottom there you see some other things. Here's where things like OpenAir. If you have a system based on a completely different paradigm, those systems can still integrate with this vendor-neutral repository because they can consume and create FHIR resources in the record locator service over there. And you notice, of course, that in the middle of that box there I've actually got two vendor-neutral repositories. Now, there's an argument to say, do you stand up one repository, one Uber repository for New Zealand? Do you have regional repositories? I think the jury's a bit out on that one as to what's the best way to go. What I wanted to call out here is that FHIR has built into it the concept of being able to synchronise between different repositories. So using a sort of publish-subscribe type mechanism, you can set up automated processes whereby one repository can be synchronised and kept in sync with other repositories. Now, that adds complexity that you've got to think about, you've got to actually implement it, you've got to think about it. So it's a deployment decision to make. The point here is that FHIR doesn't prevent you from doing it, if that's what you actually want to do. So that's sort of backgroundy kind of stuff, high level things about FHIR. want to try to sort of answer the question of where could we use FHIR in New Zealand? What are the sorts of use cases where we might want to use FHIR? The first one that I thought of was the record locator service. Now, the record locator service is an idea that's been around for quite a while. It's based on XDS, and the concept being is that it's all about finding and locating where information, particularly documents, actually sits. So it has a concept of a registry or an index of documents that people use. It has the concept of repositories which store the particular documents. You have consumers which read those, and you have creators which create them. So it's an industry standard way of doing things. And I think we've actually got a couple of implementations in New Zealand. There's one in Canterbury that I'm aware of. I think there might also be one in the Waikato. The issue here is that whilst it's a great idea, it's actually not that easy to implement. And part of the reason it's not that easy to implement is because the underlying technology is fairly complicated. It uses SOAP, it uses a thing called EBXML. So it's a great idea. It's hard to actually put it into practice. Can FHIR help? That's a question mark which I'll answer at the end of this session. You may or you may not know what I'm going to say, but we'll wait there. One thing I will point out is that one of the things we have done, and this is kudos to Alistair here, I'm not going to say nice things about Alistair all that often, but this is one of them. This is the idea that we do already have a standard for that metadata. So for the metadata that we want to store, we already know what that is. That's consistent, and that's important. Patient portals. Here's another big place. There's another big push on to have patient portals in New Zealand. So what does patient portal want to do? What does somebody who's using one of these things want to achieve?